Okay, hello and welcome, Danishka Esterhazy. Where are you right now?
I'm in San Francisco right now in the hull of my boat. Looks pretty chaotic, but this is actually where I've been getting some work done.
Awesome. And what are you working on right now?
I'm editing a film that I shot last year, and I'm doing a rewrite on a screenplay that I'm hoping to shoot actually in Ontario at the end of this year.
And what's the film that you just shot or that you're editing currently?
Oh, yeah, so I shot a little indie film called Shadowy Lines. It's a ghost story. Shot in black and white, and it was a bit of an experimental process for me. It was my first feature where I was also the cinematographer, and we did a lot of improv, and it was a sort of a guerrilla shoot, really interesting experience. So I'm putting that together right now.
Awesome. And you were recently in Sundance, and you won an award. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I was in Sundance, and I won the Amazon Video Direct Filmmaker Award. It's the first year they've given that award out at Sundance, and it's for an independent film that's doing well on Amazon streaming in America. So they chose two independent filmmakers who were at the top of their charts last year, myself and Justin Dosher, and brought us out to Sundance for the big award ceremony.
And what was that film? That was
Blackfield, my first feature, Blackfield.
amazing. And for Blackfield, um, there's a quote that stands out to me very, very strongly. And it's when Maggie McGregor says to the stranger who appears on her farm, she says, "I'm a plain spoken woman." And so the dialogue in that film is very sparse, but it's very poignant. And I know that sometimes women aren't really like it's a stereotype that women don't really aren't that precise and that like plain spoken. What do you think about that?
Well, it's weird. There's definitely this stereotype, I think, in the film industry that there are, chick films and there's films that women make and women want to watch, but I think it's a completely inaccurate stereotype. The filmmakers that have really inspired me, the women filmmakers like Jane Campion or Sofia Coppola, they use beautiful cinematic imagery and very sparse dialogue, and those films have always really spoken to me. Their female protagonists are complex and interesting, but the stories aren't necessarily dialogue driven or romance driven. So, yeah, I think there's just a real misunderstanding of what women are capable of in the film industry. I really hope that's changing.
It's funny because I was going to ask you who has because it's also Women's History Month, March. I was going to ask you what filmmakers inspired you, but you've already answered that question.
Well, it's the
So,
current filmmakers that inspire me, but I mean, cinematic history is full of really interesting filmmakers. I've always thought a lot about Nell Shipman and what she did in early Canadian silent film history, where she was a writer and a director and a producer and an actor, and really had control over the entire production space in early cinema. And I think a lot of women were given that kind of access to filmmaking when film was new. But then once the studio power became very large and the budgets became much larger, women were really pushed out of filmmaking, and we're still trying to get back in.
if there was anything that do you think, is there one thing that you could change that could change that, do you think? Besides changing stereotypes? Ideas?
I would love if Telefilm would follow the lead of Sweden and many other progressive film funders around the world and aim at a 50% quota for women's funding.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like we've been talking about women getting hired and women getting funded for decades now, and the stats haven't moved. In fact, they've become worse. Last year's celluloid ceiling report said that women directors actually lost 2% of market shares, and that we're down to something like 7% of major films released in theaters are directed by women, and that's insane. And it's not going to change with more mentoring programs and more panels. It's really only going to change when women are hired and women are given equal funding.
Okay, so you kind of touched on what I was going to ask you about Telefilm. They put out the gender parity statement that, in November of 2016. So I think you're saying that's not enough.
It had no hard numbers attached to it. It was yet another statement saying we're going to make a difference for diversity, but that historically has never worked. No agency that's come out and said we're going to be more diverse has ended up more diverse unless there's actual quotas and numbers and money attached to it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's hard facts speak volumes, right?
A plain speaking woman.
There we go. Well, that also brings us to, well, it's International Women's Day, which is what inspired us to do this talk with you. A Canadian woman filmmaker with a strong point of view. And I was going to say, are you going to celebrate? Or what are you doing to celebrate International Women's Day?
I like to celebrate International Women's Day. I mean, as much as I see things that need to change, we have, made history and achieved a lot as well. I think it's important to celebrate both our victories and to have a clear eye on the future for equality for women. I usually celebrate by watching films by other women, listening to music by women, reading books by women, celebrating fellow female artists.
Awesome. Nice. So the sparse dialogue theme seems to run a lot in your work, because when I saw the film that you have on Canada Screens, H&G, it also had very definite and dialogue that was not overly done, and the characters and what they did spoke volumes.
Yeah.
What inspired? Well, I'm just wondering what inspired that particular story.
Well, that story, I mean, my stories are often inspired by history or fairy tales, and so that obviously was my retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but set in contemporary Manitoba, dealing with contemporary issues of child poverty and child abandonment, and children at risk. And I was greatly inspired by a film called Treeless Mountain, which is a film about two young children, and they used non-actors in the two roles, and I really thought the performances were really engaging. And so I wanted to use a really similar method to how that film was made, in that we chose children who weren't actors, and we didn't give them a screenplay to memorize. In fact, when I met with their parents, I encouraged them that they could read the screenplay to the children if they wanted, but I encouraged them not to prepare or not to rehearse and not to have anything ready. And each day we just treated it like a game. So they would come to set, and I would tell them the basics, what was happening in the scene, and then we would just explore the scene. And I had dialogue written, and so if I wanted them to say specific lines, I would call the lines off from behind the camera to try and get the children to repeat them. And they're very natural at that age, so they had no trouble at throwing particular dialogue into a scene that they were really just playing imagination with. But I didn't want to load them down with a lot of memorization. I wanted the scene to come organically from their experience, sort of creating it together in real time.
Yeah, I guess that they do come across supernaturally, like they not supernatural, but very, very natural. Which it's a tough subject matter. Like
it is.
Yeah.
But we also protected the children very carefully. One of my co-producers and the co-writer of the film, Rebecca Gibson, she is the mother of one of the children, Annika, who plays the little boy. She's actually a little girl, but she played a little boy. Oh. And so she was on set all the time, and Breezy, our other child who plays Gemma, her parents or grandparents were on set all the time. And we would not have the children on set during the really more difficult scenes. Even some of the scenes where there's conflict and the children are in the scene, we would do the majority of the scene with the children away, and then we would bring them in for their roles in the scene. So they didn't really see any of the scarier things that happen in the movie. We protected them from that as much as possible, and tried to keep the experience for them. Even though the subject matter is very dark, we wanted to make the film shooting experience really light and really positive.
Yeah, it really comes across. So if people can, if they're curious to see what we're talking about, they can watch it on Canada Screens. And what else did I want to ask you? Trying to think if there's anything else. Well, there's so many things. I just so you're. Oh yeah, I know what I was going to ask you. When Okay, so when you were thinking about what you wanted to do when you grow up, did you think about directing and making films?
No,
Um,
actually came really much later, I think, than it does for a lot of people. And partly just maybe the generation, I grew up in, filmmaking wasn't accessible to most people
okay.
outside of, very major centers like Los Angeles or Toronto. So I didn't grow up around any filmmaking in Winnipeg. But I was always a storyteller. And I had a group of friends, some girlfriends, and we wrote elaborate story worlds together. And, elementary and junior high, we created these multi-generational characters in this club we formed called Dream State. And so I was always a big fan of storytelling. But how I found an outlet for that early in my career, in my 20s, was as a musician. I played as a professional musician for many years as a harpist, and I composed music. And that was my outlet. And it wasn't until later when I finally bumped into the film scene in Manitoba and did some training at the Winnipeg Film Group that I started to discover how deeply I loved filmmaking. But I wasn't one of those lucky kids whose parents had a Super 8 camera and who, I ran around making films as a 10-year-old or something. That wasn't part of my experience.
But you were writing.
Yeah, I was writing. Writing's cheap. All you need is a pen. Anyone can write. Filmmaking is really expensive. Even now, it's gotten better, but it's still very expensive.
So at that point, when you discovered, I really like this, what were your thoughts about actually making that your career at that point?
It snuck up on me so quickly. I guess it's one of those things when you find, the thing that is your fit, pretty quickly. So I was still performing as a musician, and I was also a music teacher, and I started working on film sets as a director's assistant, actually. And I did that on several American television movies, and I kept getting promoted. So I went from, I guess, director's assistant to production coordinator to production manager, and I was associate producer. And so I was, working in the office a lot, but I really wanted to work on set. And I tried to do it through a more traditional way, through the bigger productions, through the union productions. I applied endless amounts of times to try and become a TAD, a trainee assistant director, to try and get more time on set. Could never get hired. So I just started making all my films on my own. So my day job would be, I'd be, working as a production coordinator or a director's assistant on, some Lifetime movie. And then on the weekends, I'd, grab the crew members I'd met on set, and I'd go and make my own films with no budget. And so that's how I got started.
Awesome. And how do you think about getting hired as a director in that game of the film industry? Has that been something you've thought about doing?
Yeah, I certainly would love to get hired for more director for hire work, but it's brutally difficult. Partly because of the way producers hire in television, especially, I don't know if it's especially in Canada or at least in Canada, is that, they're much more willing to give a directing job to someone who's been an actor on the show or someone who's been an assistant director on the show. It's not like they're waiting for someone who, is a graduate of the Canadian Film Centre, which I am, but they're not waiting for, a new filmmaker with a ton of formal training and independent experience. That's not the person at the top of their list in terms of breaking new television talent. So it's very hard to get, on that list of people who can be hired for television. And I'd love to do it. I'd love to be on set more often. The big challenge of being an independent filmmaker is just how rarely we get to be on set. I only make a feature film like every 3 or 4 years. So I keep my skills sharp by shooting short films and web series and music videos. But it's just so difficult to get on set as a director.
And then, and to actually have a career where you're thriving, doing your craft.
Very difficult. Yeah. So, you also teach and fill in the gaps where you can. Screenwriting is a little more sustainable. There is a lot more support for development funding, and I'm also a screenwriter. So, that is something that really helps the equation for me. And I can edit my own films, which I've also done, and that helps make things a little more affordable as well. But yeah, it's a challenge all the time, and it always will be until there are more jobs out there for women directors.
Well said. So when can we? What are we going to be looking out for next from you? Your
Shadowy Lines should be complete this year and premiering probably at the end of the year. And then I'll be off to shoot Level 16, hopefully in the fall in Ontario. So I'll be there for a few months, and we'll see how it goes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll look out for your films to come.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for chatting with us.